Anyone who has watched Ugly Betty has an opinion on her various love interests. Personally, I think they're all a little interesting, but in this video I want to talk about who is the best and who is the worst of the pale-faced rabble. First up is Walter. He had the audacity to begin the show as a cheater. That's strike one. And then he breaks the news to Betty that he's been running around in these streets by gifting her a speaker with a broken mute button. That's strike two. To add insult to injury, he's laying up with a woman from down the road. That's strike three. So is Betty going to watch you scamper in and out of that woman's house every day like some kind of horn dog? Is she meant to use the speaker to drown out the sound of your shameless infidelity? It's all arrant nonsense. Betty should never have taken him back. He has the spirit of a shrimp. The fact that her family told her to be grateful and appreciative of him is the greatest insult. It's cooked. Her family were very wicked for that one. Walter is a non-contender, and he's definitely one of her worst boyfriends. If I had to put him somewhere in Betty's braces, it would be in the back, against her lower third molar. Next up is Jesse. Jesse's first sin is being a wannabe musician. His second sin is being a wannabe musician that walks around armed with an acoustic guitar which he threatens to strum at any given moment. God forbid you should be left alone with him. And he starts warbling some half-baked song he thought of on the spot with his painfully flat vocals. I say all of that to say, he does not possess the musical prowess and caliber of skill that he believes he does. When it comes to these types, the music is never good enough to justify the pouting and melodramatic posturing about why their genius hasn't been discovered yet. When he kissed Betty while drunk, then proceeded to ignore her, I was both shocked and unshocked. He looks like the type with a rather pathetic aversion to sense. He spent their whole date talking about himself, as boys with guitars, with dreams loftier than their abilities, are often wont to do. It's not surprising he liked Betty, because she made him feel better about himself. The creative boys in these kinds of shows always need reassurance that their mediocrity is actually high art. Jesse was never a real love interest despite Betty's pick-me-isms. Getting the boy coffee every day and pretending to run into him outside the building, Betty's stand up. But that being said, he's another flop and belongs in Betty's lower molars like Walter. Zachary. You will be forgiven if you don't recall that Betty dated a man that looks like the small boy from Stuart Little. And when I say small boy, I do mean the human child, not the rat. Although ironically, Zach did turn out to be a rat himself. He wanted to keep Betty a secret, to maintain the ruse that he dates models, so people will think he's hip and happening. Is that how this works? I need a correspondent from the theatre world to tell me if this is something that actually happens. To me, it reads foolish. Seeing a bespectacled man next to a tall, thin woman isn't going to make me leave my home to go watch his plays. Speaking of his plays, the little we did here didn't inspire confidence. I know it was just scene filler and unimportant because the man is probably in 1 or 2 episodes, but the dialogue felt tepid and a cliche attempt at what a play is supposed to sound like. And I have no doubt he tried his absolute best to reach that outcome. Now, Betty socking him in the jaw when she found out he was keeping her a secret, that's a wild response. I'm not sure the crime fit the punishment. He's a loser, plain and simple, and just another boy going into Betty's lower molars like Walter and Jesse. Let's talk about Daniel. Supposedly, Betty's decision to leave Mode left Daniel's head twirling so furiously, he turned into a helicopter and whizzed over to London just to see what's good. And to my absolute shock, people are eating this up. Ships are being sailed in their names. And I have to levy one question at you Betty and Daniel supporters. Why? Where was the groundwork? You could tell me the grass is orange, but that wouldn't make it so. And the same goes for that relationship. You tell me there's romantic potential, but I don't see it. If you guys want to believe that Daniel was giving Betty the eye in earlier seasons, more power to you, mama. We of course have to talk about Molly, the frumpy school mom, as I believe Wilhelmina describes her. She's meant to be this stepping stone between Daniel's type and Betty, but to me it still feels like a leap, jump and a prayer that he would ever date Betty. The mental gymnastics needed to believe that Daniel sees her as more than just his dowdy office girl is too great for me. Speaking of how Daniel sees Betty, he said with the mouth God gave him that he will always see her as his little assistant. How does someone go from that to seeing Betty as his sugar pie, his honey bunch? If they ever were a couple, would she still be bending backwards and forwards to accommodate him? I fear she would always be his proverbial footstool and quasi-second mother, because that's the role she played in his life from the moment they met. She was propping him up whenever he was white girl wasted and or heartbroken. They need to figure out how to be friends before anything else. Case in point, when Betty didn't go to her own photo shoot because she wanted to watch him catch some Z's because he was struggling to sleep. Now that's a kind act from a friend, but a foolishly timed one for a girl trying to climb the corporate ladder. I believe Daniel knows Betty does too much for him, but dismantling that dynamic would probably take more work than he's used to doing. I would put Daniel somewhere in the middle of Betty's braces, a lower incisor maybe, or an upper premolar. He really irked me in the beginning, but I came around to him and his spiky hair eventually. He was kind to Betty's family, like when he bought them the Christmas tree. However, I think Betty and Daniel are better suited as pals. There's no need for them to canoodle or lay up together. She may have ditched the braces and had a kind of glow up, excluding that heinous side fringe, but the image of Daniel and Betty together is beyond jarring. Let men and women be friends in 2024. Next we have Matt. Matt showing up to hang out with Betty without his wallet boggles my mind. Maybe he was trying to sniff out if she was a gold digger, which is spine curling, or maybe he genuinely just forgot it, which I would argue is a slappable offense. Matthew needs to be so for real. Betty is better than me. My mouth would have puckered and soured. I would have told him there are dishes in the back, better roll up your sleeves. That being said, he did have his generous moments, like when he offered Betty's family money for their house deposit. Like Matt, his parents had a peculiar energy to them. His mother indirectly called Betty a povo chick from Queens, who had no business schlepping her kitten heels around her house. Meanwhile, Matt referred to his father as Satan, if I'm not mistaken, a fact he waited a while to mention, choosing instead to weep about coming from a wealthy family. Matt's inability to see anything through was both sad and worthy of spectacular side-eye. Not bombastic, but spectacular. He chose to cackle like a hyena with Amanda watching YouTube videos instead of helping Betty and Mark with the Yeti project they were working on. I can't stand jobless behaviour, and this has nothing to do with employment. Betty kissing Henry while she was dating Matt was a bozo move on her part. Having said that, Matt's decision to become a nuisance in Betty's life thereafter was beyond embarrassing. He rubbished her at work, in front of her colleagues, and that's disgraceful for him. Show an ounce of decorum, Matthew. You're in public. His new Sonic the Hedgehog haircut had him a little too brave, especially when he implied Betty was sleeping with Daniel. His mouth was running on hyperspeed, it seems. He does eventually course correct his foul behaviour, but why did he need a telling off from Betty and a punch from Daniel to get there? When Betty and Matt do get back together, he returns to his boring, largely inoffensive ways. He was so invested in getting back together, he jumped at the idea of having Betty's baby. Whether he would have stuck around to raise it, that's open for debate. All in all, Matt is very tepid. I would place him maybe in the middle, next to one of Betty's lower incisors, or an upper premolar, next to Daniel. In fact, they are the same breed of man when you think about it. Were it not for his pathetic post-breakup tantrum and his wallet debacle, he might have ranked a bit higher, but Matthew was nothing spectacular, let's be honest. But his bank account sure was. We're on to Henry, and this one's a doozy. It's important to establish that there are two Henrys. Henry before Charlie, and Henry after Charlie. Henry and Betty's relationship before Charlie was very cutie pie. He was the nerd with abs of steel that remind us that life is full of pleasant surprises. He was the quote, hot nerd, with the Dorito-shaped bod, except for the episode when he returned with his girlfriend from Tucson, and he looked disheveled. I don't know what that was about, but aside from that, generally hot nerd. Betty and Henry, before Charlie, were the best suited couple in my opinion. I really wanted them to have a conventional relationship once the human speed bump that is Walter was out of the way. Introducing Charlie was a means to add spice and tension to their story. Walter apparently wasn't an obstacle enough, and then on top of that, the writers foisted Henry and Charlie with an unplanned bambino, whose paternal lineage was called into question for an episode. This whole saga was dragged to hell and back. Although Charlie's pregnancy is pivotal in the breakdown of Betty and Henry, I believe their downfall can be traced back to 4 key issues. Had any of them been rectified, I believe Betty and Henry could have ended up together. 1. Betty hesitates when dumping Walter. She dragged her pattern socks for far too long, when she should have dropped his sorry behind the first chance she got. 2. At the Christmas party, Betty sees a woman kissing Henry. He tries to explain what happened, but she just had to run away in her little kitty cats. If she had stopped to listen, instead of getting in the lift, the issue could have been easily rectified. Also, she was still with Walter at this time, so what right does she really have to get wound up about it? 3. Henry called the house and told Hilda to pass on a message. Hilda being Hilda, of course she didn't do it, but if she had, Betty and Henry could have spent Christmas break watching movies and adjusting their glasses while gazing into each other's eyes. But remember, Betty still needs to dump Walter. If Hilda had passed on Henry's message, he probably wouldn't have spent Christmas having a romp with Charlie in Tucson. And the 4th key issue, Henry didn't tell Charlie to go home. Sometimes you've got to tell people to just kick rocks. If Henry had grown anything resembling a spine, she wouldn't have lingered around New York looking like a fool. And a quick side note, speaking of Charlie, that ginger nut is shameless. You did bits and bobs in the dark with Henry over Christmas, and you followed him across the country. Perhaps he invited her, but I don't recall that being the case. If I am wrong though, please let me know in the comments. But to my memory, he seemed surprised to see her in that mode office. Second note, when Henry tells Betty he did the horizontal tango with his ex, I don't know why she was so bothered. You were still with Walter before Christmas. So those are the 4 key moments that altered Betty and Henry's fate. But back to assessing Henry's character. He's a little too loose with his lips, if you ask me. He was gung-ho to try and kiss Betty while Charlie was in town, and then he actually kisses Betty while he has a girlfriend, and she's seeing Matt. Get it together, Henry, and stop passing your lips around like a party favor. Betty and Henry were never meant to be. It would have been nice to see them have a functional relationship, but alas, you can't get everything you want in this life. I would rank Henry before Charlie, at the top of the list. Next to one of Betty's upper incisors, for sure. He saw Betty for who she was and accepted all of it. I thought it was sweet when he attempted to learn fashion terms to help Justin with maths. He was supportive of Betty without trying to change her. Henry after Charlie would have to be on the bottom of my list, but above Walter. An upper first molar, I would say. The mess was just too much for any sensible person to bear. Betty tried infinitely more than I ever would have. And lastly, we have Gio. I'll come out and say it. I can't stand this man. I think he's a pint-sized fool. I'm flabbergasted and bewildered by people who think this man is Betty's best option and want a man like him. I have many issues with Gio. The first being, he negs. He negs Betty. He reads books about negging women religiously. He subscribes to the philosophy of negology. No self-respecting man would listen to those charlatans that call themselves pickup artists. He's pushier than a PTA mum. He's insolent, immature, and pretentious. Case in point, the sandwich palaver, aka the day Betty and Gio met. He looked at her and said something like, "I know you're an eater," because Betty isn't rail thin like the women at Mode. How dare he speak to her in that manner? Especially about someone he doesn't know. She asked for a sandwich like everyone else, and he refuses to make it because he doesn't like the toppings. He seems to believe making sandwiches is some sort of high art. Who's going to tell him the truth? And in his mind, Betty's idea of a good sandwich is beneath him. In that instance alone, he creates this dynamic in which Betty must seek his approval about something as pedestrian as a Sammy. Good sir, your job is to make sarnies, food between bread, so grab some whole wheat and get to work. Later he does apologize and give her the sandwich she requested. But if he was normal, there would be no need for such a gesture. But Gio is a weirdo. Some people think Gio is such a dreamboat because he pushes Betty to go after her dreams. I have some things to say about that. 1. We cannot confuse encouragement for pushiness. He belittles and shames her for not actively working towards her goals, and then she takes action in response. When Betty is done talking to Gio sometimes, she looks like a weeping willow. He stirs up feelings of insecurity and inadequacy in her. And mama, that ain't love. That's not constructive. In contrast, look at Matt. He helped Betty make her blog. Look at Henry. When he asked Betty to marry him, he found her a writing job in Tucson. There's a difference. My second issue is, Eventually Betty has to be self-motivated. If she wants to do the damn thing, she's got to decide that for herself. Betty was still working at Mode when she bumped into Gio in London, but she was a writer now, with a new appreciation for fashion. Gio doesn't congratulate her on her promotion, but chooses to criticize. Betty gives it back to him saying he always has to be right, which is a stone-cold fact. He strikes me as the type of freakazoid that likes women who are naive and need a man to show them the world. He wanted Betty to be his ingenue and was willing to browbeat her with a baguette to get her to be so. Some people say Betty and Gio have an enemies to lovers situation, but in order for that to be the case, Gio would need to check his attitude at the door, and Betty would need to feel some kind of love for him, which she never did. Gio said Betty was always going to have a special place in his heart, which to me is terrifying and chilling, because they only dated casually for a few days, and their friendship was nothing special, at least not to me. He was really just a hanger-on, a clawing presence, gripping onto the hem of Betty's skirt. Despite his occupation as a sandwich maker, he was gifted at stirring the pot. He implied Betty and Henry's relationship was a snooze fest because they didn't go out dancing. Which reminds me, Betty dragged Henry's nervous behind to a salsa bar because of Gio's comment. And then, after initially leaving, Henry returns and put on a real show for the whole club. Was he dancing like Rasputin? Yes, but that's beyond the point. He Rasputined in the name of love, but back to Gio. He started chirping like a bird, saying Henry might have another roll around with Charlie in Tucson. That's a lousy thing to say as a friend. Gio was a worm, and nothing more in my opinion. After Betty and Henry break up, Gio wears Betty down like an old dog, and eventually agrees to date him casually. She makes a point of saying they're taking it slow. So you tell me why he steps to her the next day about going to Rome for 3 months. Which part of that is slow? Gio's brain, that's what. She turns him down and says they're just friends. She chooses to travel across America alone instead, but he takes such umbrage with this. He returns from his trip a real sourpuss, saying he needs to excommunicate her. That's arrant nonsense. Babe, Betty didn't owe you a summer spent twisting her ankles over cobblestones. And then he claims that she led him on. Is he normal? There wasn't even a dried up morsel of romantic energy coming from her. You were just standing around projecting something onto nothing and calling it a relationship. And he was still wound up about Rome when he met Betty in London, and he was engaged to someone else at this point. But his recollection of things was Betty chose Henry over him, which she obviously didn't. You see, Gio doesn't live in reality. He's too high on his own supply, and by supply, I mean baloney. The one good thing I'll say about Gio, he made a real effort for Betty's birthday with the horse-drawn carriage, but that's all he'll get from me in this lifetime. Gio is a piece of food that gets stuck between your molars and you just cannot budge. For such a minute man, he causes me mountain-sized headaches. He's a loser beyond all belief, plain and simple. So those are my thoughts on Betty's boyfriends. Henry before Charlie, I believe, is the real winner. I'm well aware many people dislike Henry because of the Charlie palaver, which is understandable. But I'll never get on board the Gio train, unless of course it's a hate train. And I'm praying this video finds people who will stand in unity with me about despising Gio. If you have Gio slander, please leave it in the comment section, as well as your thoughts on Betty's other boyfriends. I have more Ugly Betty content on my Patreon. I created a magazine article, like a feature in Mode, in which I break down a quintessential Betty outfit, and why, mostly, sometimes, they work. On my Patreon, I also post channel-related content every time I upload a video. I also give my first impressions on popular TV shows I haven't seen yet, and discuss anything film and TV related I'm watching / have thoughts on. If you're curious, the link is in my description. Thank you for watching, and until next time.